Hi, my name is Yelman Angel. Today I'm very privileged to have Scott Keck from Chartered Keck Cramer. Scott has 52 years experience.
Yes, I know. You wouldn't believe it looking at me, would you?
52 years experience working in Melbourne's real estate market and wider Australia's real estate market. Scott provides rich advice to some of Australia's biggest families and institutional landlords, tenants, and governments on their real estate holdings. Today we're going to talk about the interesting experiences and advice that Scott has in the property industry and what we're seeing today in this current market. Scott, thank you very, very much for agreeing for this interview. It's a real privilege to have you here. Scott, you started Chartered Keck Cramer with your partner in 1970. You have over 50 years experience in real estate here in Melbourne. How would you describe the current market right now, right here?
Well, it strengthens progressively on the back of population growth and increased economic productivity. If you look back over the last 50 years, one explanation, one observation is that things have just got bigger and better in the real estate markets. All the stakeholders are more sophisticated. The institutional investors are more sophisticated. The professional practitioners, whether they're valuers like me or whether they're funds managers and so on, they've all had international experience. This is a maturing of all of the stakeholders in the real estate market over the last 50 years. And alongside that, the increased population has meant that all of the capital cities have grown, the shopping centres have got bigger. So it's more active, it's more frenetic, it's more sophisticated. It's also able to be analysed with a greater degree of predictability, given the tools of analysis that we now use. And it's matured into, a really strong investment class, property generally, in CBDs. I look around and I can remember standing in Church Street, Richmond, and looking south down towards Chapel Street, South Yarra 20 years ago, and imagining that one day it would look like a canyon with large buildings either side. It now is. I can remember when South Bank was an industrial paddock and the circus used to set up there, and now it's full of buildings. I remember when you could look out one of these windows here and not see a building that was more than 10 stories high.
That's all great, but what do you make of the current market today, right here, right now?
Well, I think that I don't know of a market that's been as unpredictable just in such a short period of time and which has rebounded so quickly. I attribute it to two things. It's very frenetic, it's very businessy. There's a lot of demand across all the residential, across all of the property sectors, whether it is retail, whether it's logistics, industrial or residential. I attributed it to two things. Firstly, thinking we're on the precipice of something terrible which didn't occur. So there's been this huge sigh of relief and renewed enthusiasm. People have sprung back very quickly. But you couple that up with extremely low interest rates, and thirdly, couple that up with so much savings in the community, particularly in Western democracies, as a result of post-war baby boomer superannuation savings. You've got more capital than ever before. You've got lower interest rates such that the arbitrage between borrowing and investing has never been more favourable. And you've got, having got through the worst of fearing everything was going to collapse, and it didn't. So there's a sort of euphoric joy, and you combine it with those other things, it's no wonder that the market's being propelled at a pace that hasn't been seen before.
And will that be continued for much longer?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to stop. I think that as the financial morphine that we've had given to us by the government, such as JobKeeper and so on, wears off, some of the pain, some of the allergies, some of the economic issues and challenges facing the economy before the pandemic will seem to be still there. Low productivity, low investment, no inflation, poor wage growth and so on. These are going to haunt the Australian economy until it gets on with the fundamental restructuring that it needs, tax-wise, superannuation-wise, and particularly encouraging the reintroduction of immigrants at a higher pace than before to make up for what we've lost over the next couple of years. So I see a sort of cooling off starting to emerge in about 12 months' time as rightful concerns about inflation start to emerge, as interest rates start to demonstrate their propensity to increase again, as natural demand gets fulfilled, as a lot of the savings get placed and locked away. There's just going to be an inevitable point at which the markets are satisfied. And then I think there'll be a period starting in about 2 years from now and going for 3 or 4 years where economic restructuring in this company and in this country and the more serious economic challenges need to be met. I think we're at the best of a great time at the moment. I don't think investing now is a bad thing. There's no cliff coming. There's just going to be a moderation, a natural moderation. What goes up does come down. The prognosis for investment yields is that they will have to soften a little bit as other forms of investments begin to offer higher returns. And I think something that's going to have a lot to do with this is Biden's inflationary approach to the American economy, the instability of the American share market and the global fallout from that. So just being very careful going ahead. But still, get in there. It's still one of the best investment forms, isn't it?
So if you had $10 million to spend right now, this week, what would you be doing with it?
Well, at today's interest rates, I'd firstly be making a decision to leverage it. I'd probably be saying to myself that allows me to buy something for 15 or 16 million. I would definitely do that first. I would definitely leverage it and lock in the debt on the best terms possible. As to category of real estate, I think I would go for some residential assets and some key retail assets. I don't think that I'd be looking for commercial assets because good quality commercial assets are more expensive than that budget would allow, and long-term securely leased industrial or logistic assets are also more expensive than that budget would allow. So I would probably split my $10 million with its $6 million of debt into 2 lots of $8 million and split that equally between residential and retail.
Retail where?
I think that boutique retail strips and particular locations within broader CBD environments still have a lot of life. And I'd be looking, to buy in traditionally strong locations, but I would be managing my investment in a way to attract a very innovative retail tenant who I thought was responding to the changing environment, the demographics of this country, somebody that was prepared to take on a long-term lease and importantly put a bank guarantee behind it, because notwithstanding that they might pay, if and when it comes to valuations and interim financial reviews, my lenders are always going to want to see my tenants' leases backed by good bank guarantees. So I would be looking to buy a retail property where my agenda was to entice a modern, contemporary, long-term, innovative retailer as the tenant, and not just property per se. Mm-hmm. I would be setting a trap to entice a really good tenant.
How do you set that trap?
You've got to have location, you've got to be where there are passers by, you've got to be in an area where there's a stable residential catchment as well. The central location is one thing, immediate amenity is another. And that means you can have central location, but what's next door, what's behind, how accessible is it? You know, sometimes I've always thought that corner properties weren't particularly good for retail because nobody can park at them. You know, and quite often if you think of the most prominent corner locations, you've got to park a long, long way away and then walk back to them. I like it where people can get to the premises, where customers can get to the property conveniently. I like broad frontages where tenants can display their goods. I'd rather go for frontage than depth. And I like an area where, as a retailer, people congregate around the area at evenings. So if they're going to restaurants or theatres or other things that are open, I like to be able to have a retail premises that allows display to a lot of those passive passerbyers, not just during 9 to 5 p.m. I think a retail shop should be working, 18 hours a day, not just 9 to 5.
So keeping the conversation in retail, what's your overview on the current retail market here in Australia, particularly Melbourne?
Yeah, well, the current retail market seems to have two big influences. Obviously, and this was nothing to do with the pandemic, there's a lot more online engagement, although that's been accelerated by the pandemic. And the focus is on particular lines of goods. such as household furnishings and appliances and so on. As a result of the pandemic, people have been doing renovations at home and one thing and another. They've been concentrating less on fashion because everybody's wearing tracksuits at the moment and not French suits, So there's been a change in demand and there's been a change in the way people buy. But I think that will have some lasting legacy. But I think it will swing back. It's also, in a direct real estate way, of course, affected the rentals and occupancy rates in most of the traditional retail centres. But again, if you take a shopping centre, for example, whether it's neighbourhood, sub-regional, regional, or whatever it was, you go back 10 years ago, it was all about retail, nothing else. What it still has today, these retail centres, is that they have strategically located, large, accessible, prominent land holdings, appropriately zoned and developed with high quality improvements, well maintained. In fact, from a structural, physical and locational perspective, these centres are still extremely good real estate. The only thing that raises a question mark over them at the moment is the tenancy mix, and that's a management factor. So you bring smart contemporary management to any existing centre and you will overcome a lot of the current challenges. In the same way that you take a major centre like Chadstone, for example, has pivoted away from being solely retail to doing everything from selling cars to having offices to restaurants to theatre to hotel to hospital to medical. I don't know if it's got all of those things. It probably does or may as well have. And that's a leading example of how retail centres need to morph into being community centres. And that's a management factor. Now, some people would argue, yes, that makes common sense, but these diversities of uses aren't as profitable as retail, don't operate at the same margins, can't pay the same rent. I don't know that that's the case. You put a good firm of accountants or a good doctor or a good WeWork or an office space co, something like that, into any of these centres, you get a good strong tenant, they can afford to pay the rents. So I think the future of retail properties is all about management, not so much the locality. And if you look away from retail centres and take a strip centre, for example, and whether that's Burke Road, Camberwell, Glenfrey Road, Hawthorn, Malvern Road, Glenfrey Road, Malvern, High Street, Armidale, Puckle Street, Moody Ponds, Chapel Street, South Yarra, Bridge Road, Richmond, or wherever it is, a lot of those centres became popular because they were originally developed in the Australian context with shops and dwellings. And a lot of them are still shops and dwellings. And one of the secrets could be that in the future, maybe more of them might revert to dwellings. Because if you go to High Street, Armidale, you can buy a shop and dwelling for $2 million on a reasonable block of land that's got about 400 square metres of building in it. To go around the corner and buy a 400 square metre house on the same piece of land is going to cost you $4 or $5 million. If you don't mind living on the main street, you can convert a lot of these properties into very good alternative contemporary residences. And this is a trend which is very evident overseas. So like everything, there's another life. And it's just a matter of being ingenious. I see a lot of opportunity in retail strips.
Mm-hmm. And how about CBD retail across Australia?
Well, I'm a Melbourne man, so I'm most familiar with Melbourne, but I guess, Sydney and Brisbane, I travel a lot there. I think that these centres still have an extremely important role to play.
The centres or CBD?
The CBD, these CBD centres. My observation, and this is part of the way of answering the question, my observation is that online is very good for cheaper things that are highly consumable, that you don't need to try and see or touch. There's a great deal of reliance that the product is what the product is. Now, the moment you move to wanting to buy a really nice handbag, you want to smell a really nice perfume, you want to try a really nice suit, you want to look at a really good piece of furniture, you want to admire an artwork, any time or moment that you want something that is boutique, bespoke, quality or expensive, that's where traditional retail still has a major role. And you combine that in a CBD where you've still got other diverse attractions, and a day in town is still a day enjoyed.
You have some retail clients who run retail businesses and you give them advice on their rentals?
Yeah.
What's your prediction on just overall, on a macro level, what's your predictions on retail rents throughout prime strips and centres?
There are a number of factors at play there. I think one of them is outgoings, particularly land tax, where the responsibility ultimately falls, where the growth in land tax gets to. I personally don't have a problem with land tax, strangely enough. I think that if you can afford to have a property that attracts it, you can afford to pay it. Taxing property, taxing the rich has been something that will never change. But from a tenant's perspective, I think, the current shakeout that we're going and the period of challenge that we're going through will present some retail tenants with the opportunity to take on new premises and lock in relatively low rents for the longer term, so they'll get a bit of a reprieve. I think from a lessor's perspective, the owner's perspective, they might have to give a little more than they've traditionally been used to, but if there's no tenant in the shop, there's no blood in the body. You've got to go out there and be innovative. And without, particularly complimenting you, I think more so than ever, agency expertise is paramount to this. I think more so than ever, lessees and lessors need strong professional advice from people that are on the ground and knowing what these deals are. I think one thing that will change is that we will see a move towards longer first-term leases, not just to lease and options, but longer first-term leases.
Why is that?
Well, I think that longer-term leases would normally have a more reliable projected rental growth flow than if it's interrupted by market returns to option. This gives tenants a better financial management of their business, at the same time importantly protecting their tenure and the saleability of their business goodwill, which options would otherwise provide, but I think longer terms give more certainty.
You've been in business for close to 50 years in Melbourne, practicing at the highest level of property. What's the one deal that sticks out the most, that you're most proud of, or transaction?
Well, there have been some very significant commercial transactions and valuations. When Eureka Tower was developed in Melbourne, I've had it said to me by most of the stakeholders in that the confidence to go with that project was attributed to my belief that the values that made it work could be obtained. I was apparently the only valuer that thought that at the time, so I take some credit from that. QV, I look back now and see how that asset has stabilised. I think it's an excellent asset. I think when I remember back, we were the valuer that was most supportive of that at the time. More recently, because our firm now does a lot of transaction advisory, our CEO Peter Hutchins was personally responsible for the innovative approach to the introducing of third-party equity to the Moonee Valley Racecourse and all of the development that will now go on out there for decades. So there are these big projects. The most meaningful projects, I've got to say, the ones that have brought me real happiness, have always had a very personal flavour to them. Whether that's helping somebody that really had a problem. There are examples where, tenants have wanted to sell their business and they haven't had a long-term tenure, and I've been able to go and speak with their landlord and secure that tenure for them. That gives me a great deal of happiness. When I see a reasonably immature tenant that's been confronted with very high asking rents, or they have a problem with their landlord, or a landlord that has a problem with their tenant, I've often been able to go in there and be a bit of a circuit breaker and bring two parties back to the table. That gives me a great sense of attraction, a sense of satisfaction rather.
So Scott, you've helped many, many people with their careers and helped people start their own businesses, myself included. Who's the one person that gave you your first break and helped you come up the ranks?
Well, that's easy to answer because I've never forgotten. When I first started in real estate in 1969, and I was based in Box Hill in a real estate and valuation practice, and a few years later that had changed in nature to become just a valuation practice. That was about 1972. The then established Melbourne legal firm, Core & Core, had a mortgage book where it took funds from private investors and lent them out on first mortgage, traditional solicitors' first mortgage funds. And that was very ably run by one of the lawyers at Core & Core named Ian Phipps. And if he's still alive and he could end up watching this. through a series of introductions, which I won't go into detail with, Ian asked me to do a valuation of a substantial residential property in Camberwell, and I did it, and I did it well. That was a big deal for a little valuer from Box Hill to be valuing an expensive home in Camberwell, and he was pleased with the job, and he sent me more. And then he asked me, you know, would I do commercial valuations in the CBD? And of course, at that stage, still being relatively young and enthusiastic, I said, of course. Now, what I didn't know at that time was I was doing a good job. I was working very hard to do them well. He had a liaison with another fellow named Vernon Spencer, who was the finance partner at Randall & Co. And these bring back names: Ian Phipps, Brian Randall, who's still well and alive today, Vernon Spencer, who's still well and alive today. They all moved forward and graduated into more sophisticated commercial lending, and they took me with them. And so Ian Phipps opened the door of opportunity for me at Core & Core. It was carried substantially by Vernon Spencer at Central Mortgage Registry, as it was then called, and that came out of Randall & Co. So when I look back, without those guys, I think it would have been slower and harder. Mind you, I grasped the opportunity.
Looking back at your long, successful career, what advice do you wish someone gave you 40 years ago, knowing what you know now?
I've actually thought about that, because as you get older, you do reflect without necessarily being asked the question. Firstly, I don't think I'd change a lot, but what I would have done, for the first 20 years of my career, I looked at the real estate world purely through the lens of a valuer. And I think valuers tend to become quite specific, and they see things quite narrowly. More recently, over the last 10 years, I've broadened my interests and associations with directorships and other advisory roles. I now have roles in with a major construction firm, the fifth biggest builder in Australia, ADCO. I was on the superannuation, property superannuation side of industry funds. I've been in funds management as an advisor. I advise Wingate. I chair their investment committee. I've now got a lot broader interest. I wish I had taken that broader interest a lot earlier in my career, because I think all around it would have made me a much more versatile and understanding property person. I don't think that just being a valuer alone, you can be a good valuer, but I think as a valuer alone, you're on the doorstep but haven't crossed the threshold into the larger, broader property world. And I found it so much more rewarding, so much more valuable, so much more educational, and it made me of greater value to my clients once I opened those doors and looked into those other sectors. So I wish I'd done that earlier. That's one thing. And at a personal level, and this applies not only to the property sector, I think it applies to all careers, I wish I had fully understood the benefit of the power of concentration at an earlier age. I find now that the key to most things, and the definition of intelligence, is really all wrapped up in how much you concentrate. And frankly, I've got to say that, you know, I got along very well the first 20 to 30 years of my life, knowing things, being familiar with things. But if I had the respect then for the power of concentration that I've got now, I think I could have done more with it.
What would your advice be to any landlords who own retail properties in this current market, and how to engage with their tenants?
Well, I think don't be panicked by some of the challenges you hear verbalised about online and the pandemic and those things. Just take things calmly. In any property portfolio, there will be a range of property, your best and your worst. I think it's always a good idea to keep your property portfolio liquid, so I might trim off the one that I think's the worst, look forward to replacing it with something that's better for the longer term, keep the vegetable patch fresh. So physically, consider whether locations have just changed momentarily or whether you think there's something more strategic going on. Always keep an eye on the adjoining property. Remember that a good relationship with the tenant will ensure that your property investment performs at its best. Be compassionate. It's a marriage. A landlord and a tenant have a very strong relationship, and the greater the respect between the two parties, the more successful it will be. But don't panic. You know, retail's got a great life. It's just a matter of moving with the times, being contemporary. And as I think I mentioned before, I don't know whether it's been edited in or out of our comments, but knowing you, I'd say it's edited in. I think you want to rely more and more on the sophistication of really good retail agents who do understand the market. More so, it's more relevant than ever before.
But what's your understanding of the market for retail? Someone says, I have a retail asset, what do you want me to do with it? Or I have a retail shopping center, what do you want me to do with it? What's your understanding and your advice?
Well, I mean, it's all about keeping the income going.
Yep.
Keeping the income going means having the appropriate tenant.
Yep.
If you've got a tenant that's struggling, talk with the tenant, work out if you can help them or whatever. But if they ultimately fail, or if the property is vacant in any event, be very careful about the tenant you choose going forward. Do everything you can to make the property attractive. Be innovative. Offer them start out by talking in terms of a long-term lease rather than a short-term lease and options, Maybe contribute more to the fit-out. I think a lot of landlords are told by the agent, oh, we've got your property let. They put the phone down and they don't really think twice about who the tenant is. Take much more interest in who your tenant's going to be. Be very proactive as a landlord and not lazy.